Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 10th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we get into the show, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I have the bandwidth to do this show. And the reason I can keep going is really because of the incredible support from individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support, just visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. All right, so let's talk nerdy. This week, I had the opportunity to finally interview a brilliant scientist and writer whose work I absolutely love, and I can't believe I haven't had her on the show before. Her name is Dr. Alexandra Horowitz, and she is a dog cognition researcher. She literally observes dogs for a living. She loves to study dogs at play, and she actually runs the Dog Cognition Lab at Barnard College. She's written several books, including Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know, Being a Dog, Our Dogs, Ourselves, and one of my favorite books, On Looking. But she's got a new book now, and this new book is really exciting because it's called The Year of the Puppy, How Dogs Become Themselves. So let's talk about dogs, puppies, all the things we love. Without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Alexandra Horowitz. Well, Alexandra, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Cara.
Of course. So I have to tell you, I've been a big fan of your writing ever since. I think the first book of yours that I read was On Looking. Was it On Looking or On Walking? It was On Looking, right?
On Looking, about walking and looking.
Yeah.
So
I love that. I actually, not only do I love that book so much, but just conceptually, theoretically, kind of there's a depth to it that, I don't know. I share that with a lot of people. I think, as a therapist, as somebody who's really interested in perspective taking, I just find that it's a really meaningful book for people to think outside of their frame. It's exactly what you do, right? This book helps people think outside of their frame.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Actually, that's lovely to hear. And I come to it from an animal behavior, animal cognition background, trying to imagine the perspectives of non-human animals. But really, that's just the same thing we need to do with each other, with our own sort of parallel perceptual universes. And so it feeds into lots of different disciplines, I find.
Of course. And then, of course, when I look at all of the other books that you've written, that's when we come back really heavily into this kind of dog behaviorism, dog cognition. You've written quite a lot about dogs. This is your area of expertise. We're going to get to The Year of the Puppy, which is your new book, but I would love to kind of maybe take a step back and be like, what a cool job. How did you go about becoming like the dog lady?
Yeah. Completely accidentally. Absolutely. When I entered a PhD program, I did not think I was going to be studying dogs. I lived with dogs, but I didn't think, I guess, as most of science, I didn't think of them as real sort of serious subjects of scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Right. We think of them as like fun pets.
Yes. Right. And always around and kind of already understood in some important way, right? Like not complicated. And happily, I've been able to complicate them a lot in the last 20 years and talk about, the interests that they actually do have and sort of re-see their role in our lives. But I was interested in non-human animal minds and was looking for ways to look at natural behavior that might tell us something about the minds of animals as opposed to simply experimentally. For all the reasons.
Okay, so more kind of observation or a more naturalistic approach to understanding these, which is interesting because they're not wild animals, but of course they still do exist in a milieu. They exist in nature and we can observe them.
Yes. And I think, in fact, natural behavior is what we want to look at. And even experimentally, if you're creating an experiment, what you hope to do is provoke natural behavior, right? Where you've kind of just constrained the variables and constrained the types of things they can do or the types of things that your subject can respond to. When you just look at animals behaving in the wild, or for dogs, that's just sort of among other dogs and people, you're also seeing that natural behavior is just less constrained. And so it's a little harder to make big conclusions, ready conclusions, but there's still plenty that can be seen if you look close enough and long enough and slow down the videotape, essentially. And that's what I wound up doing for my PhD.
What specifically did what question did you ask?
I was really interested in naturalistic ways of looking at this idea of theory of mind, whether a non-human animal has a theory of mind as humans do, meaning basically just thinking about others' minds, sort of understands that they themselves are distinct in their knowledge state and their perceptions and their feelings from others. And it's certainly a real big, important part of being a human among humans. And it's probably important part of being an animal among other animals, but it's very tough to experimentally get at it. All the human tests are linguistic. You basically, I can ask you, Kara, do you realize that I have a different perspective or understanding on this topic than you do? And, you can affirm that linguistically. An animal cannot. And so you sort of have to look for evidence of it in their behavior. So I was interested in that question theoretically. And I thought that play behavior actually might be a way that it would pop up. I read a great book by Mark Bekoff, who studied canids in the wild, and Colin Allen, who was a philosopher, where they suggested that social play might show intentionality, might show sort of thinking about others' intentions and acting with those intentions in mind. And I remember underlining that line and thinking, all right, so I'm going to look at social play. And then I was looking for basically animals who played a lot, because I needed lots of videotape evidence of play to try to puzzle out the social situations where they need to be thinking about each other's minds, right? And all sorts of animals play, right? All the animals that I was observing played, but they don't play often. They don't play for long periods. Many don't play very much into adulthood. And yet I was living with the dog and taking her out to the beach in San Diego to play like twice a day. And so it finally occurred to me, maybe this should be my study subject. And it took a lot of convincing of people that, including myself, that they should be the study subject, because people studied, primates, basically. But I finally got around to it, and they turned out to be a great fertile subject. And so I looked at, how they used each other's attention when communicating, sort of thinking about the mind of someone else when you want to communicate with them. And that's sort of a part of a theory of mind.
Oh, I love it. And as we're talking about it, I'm looking over and seeing my dog Killer with his favorite pig toy just going at it right now. It's very cute. He's coming up on his 13th birthday, but he still plays like a puppy. And so, yeah, it's sweet. The shorter periods of time, they're more punctuated, but he definitely still plays. And of course, that's like a whole thing we will talk about, but alone and together with others.
That's a great thing about dogs, is that without the pressures of having to survive or find the territory or find food on their own, they really do play through their life. Maybe they play differently, and that's fine. But especially social play will continue, through their dotage, basically. And so there's lots of opportunity to see how they're negotiating with each other.
Oh, I love that. And so you mentioned, I'm curious, you mentioned kind of the pushback and maybe even some of the internal pushback that you were giving yourself about, is this a good model kind of animal? Is this actually an appropriate way to ask these questions? The sort of, I don't want to call it stigma, but maybe bias about working with dogs. But what we haven't talked about yet is actually the stigma or the bias against the concept of animals having minds at all. I mean, I think there's like a certain level of this that's like, well, duh, and obviously, but also within the sort of scientific community, there's a lot of discomfort when people start talking about personalities or when they start to quote unquote anthropomorphize animals. And so I'm really curious what kinds of hurdles you've had to navigate as you've developed this career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I've inherited a lot of those scientific kind of preconceptions that we really should be wary about anthropomorphisms, that, you have to prove that an animal has some mental capacity or even a personality or an emotional ability before you can affirm that it's the case. And I've slowly unpacked them myself, right? I think actually the scientific community that I'm in has undergone a little bit of a transformation. When I was in graduate school in the late 90s and early 2000s, the cognitive revolution, the acknowledgement that there was mind behind behavior in non-human animals was well underway, and so the possibility was still there, but we still were just giving that credit to big-brained animals, closely related animals like the primates. So primates, cetaceans, not all the other animals, and not dogs, certainly. And so it has changed a lot over the last 20 years. And I think even my thinking about it has changed. I still do avoid anthropomorphizing in a scientific context, but I'm not kind of completely against it. I just think of anthropomorphisms as statements that, need to be empirically tested, basically, before we know for sure. But to say that, an animal might feel jealous is an anthropomorphism isn't to say that it's wrong. It just is to say we don't have really good information one way or the other. And until we do, I'm just going to put a little asterisk by that and say I realize that I don't have the information. It feels like that's probably the case. And maybe it's something good we could test.
Right. And why is it, I guess, that there is almost this default assumption that if we are trying to make sense of an animal's behavior by identifying or by exploring their potential mental state, that necessitates that it's our human lens. You know what I mean? And I get it. We are the ones who are doing the description, but I think that we almost err on the side of that bias, because I think it's historically founded, right? Historically, literally, scientists believe that animals were just like a bundle of reflexes.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's all brainstem,
machines.
They just don't know anything and they don't think at all. But if there ever were an animal that almost every person on the planet has intimate knowledge, is capable of certain mental states, it's our dogs. You know what I mean?
Right.
We spend so much time with them and we see behaviors of them that could never be solely described as instincts.
Reflexive.
Yeah.
And so they're a really interesting case, as it turns out, because on the one hand, we over attribute to them, assuming that they're like humans in ways they probably aren't, right? Like having kind of a cultural understanding, for instance, that there's no way they could have, or even reason for them to have. And on the other hand, the response is often to just assume that there's nothing, as you say.
Right. Why can't they just be like dogs? You know? Yeah. Why can't there be a whole interior world of a dog?
Right. And so absolutely, my whole career has changed from looking at this question, of theory of mind, which was really a comparative psychological question, saying are dogs like humans in this way, right? Having this thing, to now being more interested. I'm still interested in theory of mind, but I'm much more interested in, can I understand the dog's Umwelt, what it's like to be a dog? What are the experiences of a dog, building it from the perceptual and cognitive capacities up? What's their experience like during the day? Not just what parts of my experience am I correctly or incorrectly kind of placing into the dog. And this sort of conversation we're having really recapitulates my career over the last 20 years in my thinking about dogs. It's evolved a lot.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's fascinating. That's really cool to hear that, because of course that is the scientific process and method, and that is growth, and that is change, that is, in some ways, evolution, if I'm going to use it in a literary sense. It's that this story is going to um it's going to grow as you develop new information, and you know it makes sense based on kind of the history and the paradigm of animal research previously, that it would kind of come to this new place, and you had to go through the motions to get to that new place. So I guess now I'm curious about the evolution of your actual writing, right? So like kind of the order of the books that you've written and why you chose to write what you did when you wrote it, which ultimately is going to kind of land us. Obviously, this isn't the end of the road. You're going to keep going. But as of right now, at this cross section in time, to the year of the puppy.
Yeah. Well, actually, always looking back retrospectively, it all makes sense. But at the time, I wasn't looking forward and thinking like, yeah, first I'll do this writing project and then I'll do this next one. It really does
Right.
reflect my thinking. My first book, Inside of a Dog, was it published in 2009. So I wrote it in about 2007, 2008. And it was when the field of dog cognition research was just starting to explode. And I was riding that first wave of research with many other colleagues around the world into the mind of dogs. And I saw how much it changed my way of dealing with the dogs in my household, right? Thinking about them not just as study subjects, but really trying to ponder their behavior in this other way. And so I wrote the book to kind of put out there what the research was, and hopefully kind of enter people's relationships with their dogs and let them see their dogs anew. At the time, it's hard to remember this in a way, but that was 15 years ago or so. There was not nearly as much sort of general science reporting of research results right away. Just as soon as a study comes out, like, 15 media outlets are covering it. And now that's the case. Almost many of the big dog science papers that come out, they'll be reported on in one or another venue. And so it sort of is distributed naturally. At the time, it wasn't really happening. And so it felt like I wanted like a central source of like the best and greatest information so far that would maybe change people's relationships with and ways of looking at their dogs. So that's how that came first. It's a really general survey of dog cognition and perception. And then the next dog book I wrote, which was Being a Dog, was a deep dive into olfaction, because I just got really fascinated by the fact that most of the dog cognition research and most of the comparative psychological research doesn't bother to take the sensory modalities of the subjects really into account. And dogs are primarily olfactory creatures, and all of our studies are visual. I mean,
yeah, which
of
is
course they can see.
Silly.
It's silly, right? But it's just because, again, that's an anthropomorphism, right? It's just assuming that like cognition happens in the visual medium. And we can't even really imagine cognition happening in an olfactory medium, right? Because we don't particularly engage in that. Maybe a little more if we probe our own thinking. We actually do more than we think, but most of the studies are going to be visual, and just like they're mostly with humans, linguistic. So that's the type of research we were doing with dogs. And I thought, you know what, actually we have to start again and try to understand their olfactory capacity. And that was great. I mean, I just really love thinking about that, thinking about what the world is like, what the world smells like rather than what the world looks like. And that was naturally came out of my wanting to kind of start again from the dog's point of view.
And haven't we also kind of changed some of our, not just the naturalistic approaches to research, but even our like deeply experimental approaches to research, started to kind of see through that lens as well? Like, I know we often fall back on this idea of like the mirror test and what does the mirror test tell us? It's like a really important paradigm, but like the mirror test doesn't make sense for an organism that's not overly visual. And so haven't we started to kind of develop quote unquote mirror tests that really rely on different senses?
Well, I mean, I've tried to develop one which relies on olfaction, and in fact, I did publish a paper on a kind of olfactory self-recognition test, kind of analog
Cool.
to the mirror test. Yeah, and we're doing
You
a
did
little.
that. Oh, that's so cool.
I
Okay, I
did
can't
that.
wait. Tell me everything.
Yeah.
Tell me everything.
Oh, we're doing a little redo of it now, trying to like extend it somewhat. It was so exactly as you said. That's a great example of a paradigm which is visually mediated, and we assume all other animals, if they are going to be able to pass it or not based on their visual capacity. It just makes no sense for dogs and not just because they're not primarily visual. I mean, they can see us, although they're nearsighted, but they could see themselves in the mirror, but they're not groomers either. And sort of the test relies on the fact that a person or a chimp sees a little mark on their face and wants to go and like correct the mark. Well, like, when have you ever seen a dog who's like, they're not cats. They're not spending their days like cleaning themselves and making sure they're completely free of mud. In fact, they're going for the mud and like rolling around in the mud. Like, they have a different sense of like what is pleasurable to them. And so that kind of requirement that to pass the test, you have to understand the mirror visually, and then also want to fix the thing that's wrong about your face, or in the case of the dolphins, examine more the thing that's different about your flank or your head. That's just doesn't hold as much for dogs.
It's like what we're looking for. Ultimately, the decision that we're making based on whether or not an animal can pass the mirror test is, can they recognize themselves as an embodied being? Like, that's what we're trying to understand. But it assumes all these other things. It reminds me of the marshmallow test where we do this marshmallow test with the kids, and then we're like, oh, it just means that they have good self-control. It's like, yeah, but it also means that they're food secure, and it also means that they trust adults, and it also means like, there's all these other variables that we just kind of take for granted.
Right. We love pithy experiments, Right. I mean, I think that's it. Like,
yeah.
It just feels so good to have the marshmallow test or the mirror test and feel like, yep, that's self-control. Yep, that's self-awareness. And of course, it's more complicated. And I think the makers of these tests also know it's more complicated, but it kind of works far enough. And with the dogs, you really, the smell hit the pan, as it were, and we said, "Oh, we're gonna have to create something else." And here again, I turned to Mark Bekoff, who'd been that dog researcher I mentioned earlier, who did a little study, a kind of almost like anecdotal study, I would sort of call it, where he took his dog Jethro out in the hills of Boulder where he lived, and he had noticed the fact that Jethro would sniff other dogs' urine markings, right? Which he could see against these walls of snow in the hills of Boulder in the winter. But he wouldn't sniff his own. He wouldn't sniff the one that he had left earlier on the mark. And so Mark started like, this is biology in action, guys. Mark started like taking snow shovels full of the snow with Jethro's urine mark on it and moving it to a place where Jethro didn't leave it, to see if he like recognized it as himself, even without having had the experience of leaving it where it was, right? And he wasn't interested in it when it was, in a new place. Like he seemed to see that it was him, in other words, right? Like he's like, that's me. That's my smell. I'm more interested in sniffing these other smells of other dogs. So he did, Mark did this little study, he published it. And I thought, well, that's kind of what we need to look at. Dogs are sort of leaving representations of themselves out in the world when they pee or when they mark, which is just like peeing a little bit, maybe in a higher place where it's easier to smell it. And so what if we marked that pee? In other words, that image of themselves, which they're leaving everywhere, what if it changed slightly? So it was their, but it was them, but like with spinach in their teeth, right? Like with a little mark in it.
Yeah.
would they spend more time sniffing it? Would they show more interest in it? So I basically took that into the lab, and I had dogs presented with like a little canister of a tiny bit of their own urine, or their own scent. I compared it with how long they investigated some other dog's scent that was in a little canister. And I also compared it with how long they spent smelling their own scent if I marked it with an additional scent. We used a little bit of anise, which is an essential oil that we know they can smell, but they don't want to like taste, or it's not something to eat. And they did. They spent more time with their smell marked than without. And they even spent more time sniffing the odor of themselves marked than just the odor by itself. So it wasn't that the odor is interesting, so I'm going to spend more time with it. It was that it's interesting when it's on my scent, right? Like, that's me, but something's changed, and is how I would kind of class it.
What is going on here? Yeah. Interesting.
Right. So that was my first pass attempt at creating something. As you can see, it's challenging to think in the olfactory world. Like, could you have a literal mirror, which is sending your scent towards you, and what would you do if it were changed, right? That's what I was basically trying to do with these canister presentations with them. And now we're trying to extend it a little more and see if they also show any self-directed behavior after they've smelled themselves changed, right?
Oh, interesting. Like, now are they going to try and somehow correct it or do something about it?
That's right. Do they sniff themselves and say, well, is there something? Like, did I leave that? Right?
Is that me? Yeah.
Exactly. Like, where is that? Let me fix that. So that would be interesting to see. I mean, I hope that I see that type of behavior. I might not. And even if I don't, it might not show that they're not seeing it as themselves. But these are my, inceptive explorations in how you create a olfactory mirror mark test.
I love that. So do you find that when you write, these, which are very much like trade books, right? These are not academic books. These are books for real people consumption to explore and excite and, entertain and, I guess, deepen their understanding of their companions. Do you find that it sort of follows your academic curiosities and interests, or do you sometimes just like the year of the puppy, for example, was there a spark and you were like, yeah, I'm writing this book, or was there something that happened in your academic work that made you go like, I have to tell this story?
It's always a little bit of both. I mean, it's an interesting question because I'm not sure that it's a clean one or the other. Sometimes the academic work inspires me to say, well, here's where we should be talking about this in our lives with dogs or with other animals. And sometimes the writing itself changes what I want to research, right? Just as living with dogs changes how I look at them because of what I know from the research, but also it changes my ideas about what I might research next. So for instance, right now we're doing a kind of just ethological study also where we're looking at shaking behavior in dogs, like the wet dog shake, but when they're not wet, right?
Yeah, they do that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's been posited that they do that when they're stressed, but nobody's ever studied it, actually. And I have a hypothesis based on looking at dogs, just the dogs I live with and the dogs that I observe in the Upper West Side of New York City, that they do it at moments of transition, go from one sort of activity or state to another. They're playing, they stop, they shake, and then they walk off, or vice versa. Like they're coming into the dog run and are about to interact and they shake and then they go interact. And so we're just doing a survey of when shaking happens, the context in which it happens. And that comes entirely from just living with dogs. So same with my writing. Some of it feeds into the academics and some of the academics feeds into the writing. With the year of the puppy, I really just felt that there was very little. I don't study puppies typically, and there's very little work on early development in dogs cognitively. partly because they're just hard to wrangle. It's hard to get them to, to like cooperate in your task. And that started to change even since I wrote the book. And there's a woman named Emily Bray who does great research with some of the simpler cognitive tasks, looking at how early at 12 weeks, at 18 weeks, in 24 weeks, dogs are able to do things that adults are doing. Right. She plays with puppies all day. So I wanted to just gather all the research that there was about early dog behavior. And then at the same time, in my non-scientific life, I thought maybe we could get a dog who is very young, and I would get to sort of observe her along the way, make notes about her along the way, sort of in that Piagetian way, where Piaget observed his children and took notes on his children, right? And like gave them little tests, and that was generative for him.
I like that you said in the Piagetian way and not like in the Skinnerian way. I appreciate your choice of the researcher that you were modeling there.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I wouldn't follow Piaget all the way to the end either, right? But I like that notion of being able to look scientifically at the figures in your home and say, like, I'm not making scientific conclusions, but like this is like the world is presenting things to you all the time, not just when you're in a laboratory. And why not like scrutinize them? So the book winds up being a little bit of a memoir and a little bit of the research into early dog development.
Which to me is such a beautiful approach of telling scientific stories. And one of the things that I've long struggled with, coming from the sort of world of science communication and also scientific skepticism and also academia, is that sometimes I worry that the sort of scientific skeptic, like overly logical positivist, kind of like intense reliance on that. You hear all the time, right? This like pithy kind of cliche that like the plural of anecdote is not data. And I get the point of people saying that because they're trying to say, yes, I know that acupuncture worked for you, but when we look at it systematically and we test it, we know that it doesn't work. Or yes, I know that like after so-and-so got the flu shot, they like dropped dead, but we also know that that was probably a different variable because when you look at all the data, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I think that sadly in making it so pithy, it actually undoes the fact that kind of the plural of anecdote is data. Because data is how we collect a bunch of different observations. And self-report data or observational data is literally an aggregate of anecdotes. They're just systematically collected.
Right. I think that's really nicely said. And I will say both of those things. Anecdote, the plural is and isn't data, right? Because it's applicable at different points in the process. And I think you just can't be too conclusory about what you think is happening ever. Even having done an experiment, I'm always shocked at this point. I mean, I had a different opinion earlier in my career, but I'm always shocked when any study of mine is reported on as though now we know, right? So they did this study with 42 dogs and now we know dogs can be jealous. And you're just like, no. It's actually way more complicated than that. And what we really know is that this group of dogs in this very narrow situation behaved in this way. And these are the types of things you can conclude from it. But, the verdict's still out. I mean, I've just become much less, confident about claims, especially in psychology. And this is, coming from somebody in the field, right? It's not that I'm saying, oh, those people in cognitive science, they don't know what they're talking about. Like, I am a cognitive scientist. I just feel wary of making claims that like anything is settled. It's so dependent on the methods and the context and the subjects, and the background of the researcher is really important. And I think those sociological things are really interesting. And I would be happy to talk about those as much as the conclusion that came from the study.
Oh, 100%. And like, not to get too meta over here, but coming from a perspective of also, working to become a psychologist, but on the clinical side, which means that, you take a lot of the same coursework with different kind of applications. One of the things that I like, this is going to be very, very meta, but one of the things that I work at in the therapy space with many clients is increasing our comfort with ambivalence, because part of the reason that I think the entire system wants these black and white answers, these very kind of confident answers, is because our entire sociological milieu reinforces a yes or a no, a true or a false. And so much of what I do in the therapeutic space is try to undo those pressures and really navigate what it means to exist not knowing. How do we do with uncertainty? How do we sit with ambivalence and in the gray area? So it's really funny that this kind of, I think, fundamental problem of the scientific process is actually a fundamental problem of the human experience.
I agree, right? And I think, we're undergoing something very parallel in my field. And at the same time, I understand the power of, for instance, having a diagnosis, right? Or having a name or label you can put on something, or just sort of having a question even partially answered. As a person who studies dog behavior sort of theoretical approaches to it, I'm not a person who's training dogs at all, but I get a ton of questions, which are basically just sort of like, how do I navigate this thing with my dog? My dog is doing this. I don't know what. And it's about interpretation and giving them possibilities and just any traction, even though I can't be confident in my assessment of what's happening, or I can't know for sure that this solution will change the behavior of the dog for them. Any traction they can get is helpful in moving forward, right? So again, a sort of even a tension between like being in that ambivalent space and also having some landmarks and things you can hold on to move you through the space.
Oh, 100%. I always think about like Lulu Miller and, why fish don't exist, and like this conversation about taxonomy and labeling. And of course, diagnoses. In my field, the diagnosis, there is a huge parallel between that and the label, the Linnaean system. And kind of the pithy cliche that I always use is diagnoses are really helpful until they're not. Like labels are incredibly illuminating and informative and useful until they box you in and prevent you from having any sort of flexibility. So it's like even that there's a gray area. That's the stuff I love so much. So okay, let's talk about the year of the puppy, because you're literally talking about the year of the puppy, right? From the time the puppy is born until it's a year old.
Yes. Yeah.
I got my dog. I'm going to make this about me because that's what people do. I got Killer, who is now coming up on 13, when he was 10 weeks old.
Oh,
and
great.
So
that's
I
quite
know
early.
It was very early, and it was a long, weird story that I don't have to get into, but basically he was in a shelter and he had been a backyard birth who was like not thriving. They found like this litter. They couldn't find the mother. I think maybe she was hit by a car or something. So they had to bottle feed them. And basically as soon as they felt like you can care for this dog, it's safe for you to take him. You take him. He's still too young to get his, to get fixed. He's still too young to get certain shots. So we've got to make sure that you're coming back. And of course, I knew the woman who ran the shelter, and we were quite close. And I was, even a biologist back then. And it was like, yes, this is a good thing. We're going to make sure we take care of this. But having him from such a young age, it's interesting looking back. I don't know if I thought about it at the time, but yeah, I probably did learn a lot. It probably was really informative, seeing these drastic changes that were happening, definitely week to week, but sometimes day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I had never lived with a dog who was younger than several months old, right? All my dogs who I got from shelters, our previous dog, our last dog we got, was 3.5 years old, right? You just get what you get. And
you get what you get. And also sometimes you don't get them before they're like, quote, housebroken. Like, a lot of times it's like, okay, we're going to do the training work here at the shelter so that this dog is very adoptable for you.
And doesn't get sent back to us when they...
Right. My dog like peed on my bed multiple times in those first few weeks. He had no concept.
For sure. Yeah. Of course. Right. And I mean, 10 weeks, it is possible, right? Like they are ready when you see them in a thriving situation where they've been nursed by their mother and taken care of and grown up with their litter and so forth. they're still ready to go. They're ready to go at that
he
time,
wasn't,
but it doesn't mean they're themselves, right? They're still
for
like
sure.
developing massively. Yeah, as you say, day to day, week to week. And they're about to, a few weeks in, they're going to enter like adolescence, basically, right? That's how quickly
Aww.
they're developing. And it's crazy to think about it that way. I don't think, as a person who has met and lived with multiple dogs, I don't think I ever thought about it that way. I never thought about
Right.
like how their development was proceeding kind of analogously to how my development or human
So you were
development
always
happened,
adopting dogs that were already young adults.
Yeah, I mean, even when I had a dog who was an adolescent, I didn't think of his behavior as explainable as that. Like, it felt much more essentialist. And I think people do treat their dog's behavior as essentialist. They sort of assume either the dog is like a good dog or a bad dog, and they maybe know they have to train the dog. Maybe that's what they want to do. But then if the dog doesn't do the thing they ask, they're like, well, that's a bad dog, right? Like, it's sort of weirdly essentialist. And I wanted to complicate that in this book and say, like, oh, no. Remember, this is a dog who's in development, right? And we understand that completely with children, and that we're very into the stages of what's supposed to happen at this age, and what kind of behaviors might you see in a rebellious teenager, right? Which are normal when they slam the door. It's not like it's all over. That's it. The relationship is severed. It's like, oh, no. They're distancing themselves from you. They're finding themselves. They're testing the boundaries of rules, etc. Just normal stuff. We just don't, for some reason, feel like that's applicable with our dogs. And that's a problem for our relationship with dogs, it seems to me. So that just through the year and reading the research, I came to see that. I didn't know it ahead of time myself, and I hadn't thought it that way with my own dog. So one of the nice things about writing is that I'm learning things while writing. It's not that I just have this huge font of information and I'm like, I got to dump this somewhere. Let's write a book. It's that the book itself is a process of like discovery for me. And I hope that someone else who's also living with dogs will kind of appreciate the unearthing of these new realizations as I have.
Yeah, and I think that, I think that's why your writing speaks to me so much as well, because I do think I kind of, maybe it's because by virtue of my training and being more psychologically minded, maybe it's more constitutional than that. But I do see these glimpses and I really connect with them in a deep way. Like, I think about when Killer was little, and probably I wasn't as good at the time at pacing his development. But now, it's funny, I do geropsychology. I do end of life existential work, cancer psychology, and also geropsychology. And I deeply, firmly believe, and I'm kind of like an asshole about it, like, I'm a big advocate on the idea that, like, development doesn't just stop once somebody's like 22, right? Like, we are developing our whole lives, and there's a whole complex, interesting development that happens in the end of life as well. So my dog's like an old man now, and I can't tell you how often I find myself being like, you're too old for this, Killer. Like, like, why are you still doing that? You're an old man. Or I'm like, you're just a grumpy old man, are you? That's why you're being like that. It's so funny how often I reference his age when I'm engaging with him, because I try my best to think of that frame. Like, what would I be like if I was, 13? He's a small dog. Hopefully I get, many more years out of him. He's only a 9-pound dog. Like a little mutt mix, like Chihuahua Dachshund maybe mix. But I think about the fact that, like, he's old. I gotta respect that, his independence now, and his he's set in his ways. And there's certain things that he's like, Mom, I'm not going to do that. Why are you treating me like a kid?
Right. I mean, a lot of his behavior is about who he is in his life course. And I think that, I think that's really important to realize. And frankly, like, that little type of epiphany is important for, I think, to just say that out loud. Somebody who's listening to this it will click for them. They're like, oh, that's why my dog is not playing with the ball anymore, right? Like, the frustration that they have about that loss can be turned into like an appreciation that the dog is arthritic and in a different time of life. And instead of going for a walk, really just wants to sit outside and like stick their nose in the wind, and that can be valued and part of the relationship as well. So I think those things are really, really important. We were living with 2 older dogs when we got the puppy. And the contrast to just, eventually to see how it's enlivening to have a young sprite around, even for me as well. But also, it really heightened the contrast between the three of them, and they wound up. We thought we were getting just another dog in a way, right? A third dog. You just sort of add to the other two dogs, but really, they became much more distinctive personalities, such that they
Right.
each got their own walk. I would deal with them all very differently. They interacted with each other, but you couldn't treat them as just like variations on dogs. They became even much more of who they were. And the older dogs, being old was part of who they were and part of how we should deal with them. And that, just living through that made me much more appreciative and understanding. And frankly, it was heartbreaking to have see their age so much. And
Yeah.
just last year, they both passed, and now we just have the puppy who's no longer a puppy.
Oh, wow. In
And
the same year. That must have been really brutal.
it was a very tough year. Yeah, it was really, really tough. Although they passed very different ways. And so I'm interested in your field, how that, when you're dealing with grief of having lost a pet, or anticipation of having to maybe euthanize an animal, the conversation often goes back to how we treat people who are aging and dying, or how you deal with their loss when they're gone and so forth. And so there are a lot more. I think that field is fertile and an opportunity for growth, lessons from each side that the other side might value.
Oh, and it's funny you mentioned that because, of course, my dissertation, people listening to the show know this, but maybe they do, maybe they've tuned out by then. But my dissertation is actually a more qualitative investigation, so phenomenological, hermeneutic, existential investigation, where I interview people who are choosing to die with medical aid. So here in this country, right, euthanasia is not legal. It is legal in Canada and in some countries in Europe. So we can't actually say, hey, doc, I want the injection. But we can use medical aid in dying in 11, or it's 10 states in
Right.
one jurisdiction, so 10 states in DC, where we get the prescription filled and we we take the medication ourselves, right? And so I'm actually exploring with individuals, many of them, I think MS, cancer, different reasons for it, but who have a 6-month or less prognosis and who are choosing to hasten their own death. And it is really fascinating, the conversations that we have around euthanasia with our pets and the legality of medical aid in dying. Gosh, you and I may need to do some work together in the future, like the
Absolutely.
dog people parallel, like the other side of the developmental equation, because it is funny, this, I mean, I don't know if you grapple with this much in the book, but the way that, this bias that we've been talking about from the very beginning of the conversation, this anthropomorphizing, this human lens that we cannot help but see through, yet our dogs are our children. They are our family members. We cannot not look at them that way. And so, of course, we're thinking about how we treat our aging parents, how we treat our ill or frail loved ones, and how we treat our dogs throughout the lifespan.
Yep, absolutely. And it's so interesting with the dogs that we have to start to make decisions for them that we maybe weren't making on a daily basis through the rest of their life in terms of what their quality of life is. And maybe we should be, right? Like suddenly people's attention is very hot on, what is their quality of life? What have they lost? What do they have left? And maybe they weren't thinking about that when they were 8 and the person was going to work all day and the dog was sitting at home with nothing to do all day. They weren't thinking about their quality of life. So even that conversation itself should have been like back extrapolated to thinking about sort of daily well-being.
100%. I think we saw it during COVID, right? There was almost like a little bit of a lens when people are like, oh crap, I'm going back to work. My dog's freaking out.
Right. Where it used to just be okay to leave your dog all day. Now, everybody is wondering about that, right? And certainly plenty of people already were thinking about that, but it was societally permissible. And now there are places, I think there's somewhere in Europe, and now I'm forgetting where it is, but probably it's someplace like Sweden, which is often a little bit progressive in these ways of thinking, that where you're not allowed to leave your dog for more than 3 or 4 hours by themselves. right?
Wow, that's
Because it's
amazing. I'd definitely leave killer longer than that. Wow, 3 or 4 hours. That's amazing.
Yeah.
My cutoff is 6.
Yeah.
I'm like, he's cool
Right.
at 6. But I'm only thinking about whether or not he has to go to the bathroom.
Right. Which is important, but like, it's
But
also
that's
the
not the
rest
only
of his
thing.
mental life. Right. Yeah.
Right.
It's that type of the thinking that's so heightened about life at the end of their life, I think should be fed back into how we think about living with animals and with each other, at the other times of our
Right.
life
Obviously,
when we
I
don't
take
think a
that.
life is about to end.
Yeah, I take that, very deeply because I work with people who are dying all the time. And one of the things I tell when they're like, how can you do it? It's so hard work. And I'm like, no. It's super life affirming. It's incredibly fulfilling. I'm constantly thinking about the fact that tomorrow is not guaranteed because I have that mirror and that reflection in front of me. And I am living my life deeply because of my work. And so it's interesting, those parallels as well. And of course, the one thing that kind of maybe the last thing on this note that comes up for me is this conversation about how it's so easy for us to think about the well-being of our pets and to say, okay, it's time to euthanize my dog, even though it's a hard decision, even though it's heart-wrenching. People do it every day. But of course, then the kind of puritanical and, whatever the pressures are when we're talking about medical aid and dying or euthanasia with human beings,
With people. Yeah.
it's much more complicated. Yet at the same time, our dogs can't tell us what they want, but grandma can. Like, she can literally be like,
Right.
I have capacity and I want this. And it's like, no, grandma, you don't know what you're talking about. Versus the dog is like, he whined once. Oh no, what does that mean? He doesn't have anything to live for anymore. We have to make massive assumptions based on their behavior about their internal world because they can't tell us. That goes back to like the very beginnings of your research.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that it deserves a lot more scrutiny throughout, right? When things are going well, we still are making presumptive statements about what the dog wants and needs and desires and the grudges they're holding and all these things. And, I think we have to become better behavior readers. I mean, it did so much for me to turn to animals, to look at animals, in terms of my thinking about living with them and thinking about living with other people. Frankly, I kind of wish that on other people, because it's been enormously productive. Just as you say that, working with the populations that you do changes how you look at your tomorrow.
I'm curious, you mentioned that obviously you're not a trainer. That's you're a cognitive scientist. Like, you're somebody who studies the mental state and the behavior and the connection between the two, of these animals. Yet at the same time, you yourself have dogs and, you have a behavior that you adapt towards your pets. And so, not to blurry the lines at all, like, I'm not asking about kind of training tips, but I am curious, do you take an approach that's more one way than the other? Do you tend to be more permissive with your pets and more empathic with your pets? Do you tend to be really, really firm and rigid and like behaviorally oriented with your pets? Or does it really depend on sort of the temperament and the personality of the animals that you're engaging with?
Well, it's a great question. I think I wind up, I mean, I guess it would be called permissive. I really don't do a lot of training. I mean, I think, first of all, training is kind of mispitched. It should be like just teaching your dog what you need them to know.
It's funny because I more think of like quote training. I don't train my dog explicitly, but I do a lot of like maybe some behavior correction stuff. But for me, it's all about like, I'm teaching my dog manners. That's how I think about it. Like, Taylor, that's so rude when you bark at somebody when you first see them. We need to work on that. Let's have some better manners.
I mean, I think the way I converge with that approach is that I see what we need to do with dogs is teach them what we think is necessary for them to be in human society.
Right. How do they live in our world appropriately? How do they not get us evicted from our apartments? Exactly.
That's true, right? And also, the things we tend to train, though, if somebody just goes through obedience training, are not necessarily all those things, right? They're more like, I mean, I think it is useful, for instance, to train your dog to sit down, but not because they need to sit. They don't need to sit. They just need to know that they can still their bodies. They can kind of have a lot of energy and then calm that energy and be in one place for a second, because sometimes you need them to just calm. Now, should you trot it out all the time? I don't think so. Like, I think you use it when you need to use it, not as a trick, which shows that you have kind of like command over your dog. So there are ways in which I diverge from training. Yes. And so I want to create a relationship with them. And that involves me helping them understand the things that are important to me, but not necessarily explicit training for the most part. I think the only thing that I really want to train is that they'll come when I call them, because that's a safety issue. And then over time, every one of my dogs just learns to understand the things that are more important to me. And if I have a dog, as I do right now, who's a little more pulley at the leash, I get it. She's a terrier mix. She has enthusiasms. And it's okay with me if she's not always trotting by my side, like she's entirely under my command.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that, when I train Killer, it's not about that. It's really about safety, like you mentioned. Like, I want to make sure that he doesn't run off, that I can redirect his attention to me when I need him to focus with me and be present with me, so that he doesn't chase a cat, bark after somebody, whatever, that I can make sure that I keep his attention oriented. That's the most important thing to me. So anyway, we're running into some technical issues at the end, so we're going to do something kind of creative. I'm typing the questions to Alexandra while she answers verbally. And we're going to start by asking these closing questions that I ask everybody. So I ask my guests, this is my typing voice, the same 2 questions to close the show. Number 1, I'm going to give her the brief version so that I'm not overly typing. Number 1, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? Might be pessimistic about the thing you're most worried about. And 2, where do you find your optimism? What are you hopeful for?
Great big questions. I like that. I mean, there are things that keep me up at night in thinking about living with animals. The types of things that I see as the reasons we love to live with dogs, their responsiveness to us, their behavior, just knowing them as personalities, as individuals, I feel like that's something we should be thinking about lots of other animals, including animals that are intensively farmed and eaten. And I worry about all those people, right? I see much more than I used to see, all the individual people that we call animals, the personalities who have like hopes and fears and families and connections and friendships, and can feel pain. And so that definitely worries me. I think about that with dogs, and also with non-dogs. And I wonder how we're going to make things right, as it were, as a society. I find optimism in like the seasons. So now's a perfect time. We're talking in spring. And this morning there were magnolia buds blooming at kind of the reliability of life. I think, even though animal species are being lost, and animals are being harmed or tortured at this moment, there's a continuity of things, and where you cut down one tree, it springs back up again. That at my core gives me the optimism to kind of say, okay, I'm going to keep going with this. It's not hopeless.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
It's been a great, great, great pleasure having a conversation with you, Kara. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Of course. And thank you so much for joining me, everyone. The book is The Year of the Puppy, How Dogs Become Themselves by Alexandra Horowitz.
And good luck with your work. And maybe there's some convergence in the future between your work and mine. I'd love it.
I hope so. I hope so. Gosh, thank you. Thank you so much. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.